I'm responsible for the IA's Low Carbon Energy Technology Roadmap program, which has been quite successful since it was launched in 2008. In fact, today's presentation is going to be the 21st roadmap that the IA launches, and that doesn't include the roadmap that we have updated lately, as well as some of the regional work that we've been doing. And so this roadmap program is very important for us as it completes our technology policy analysis work, looking at visions that we set up in our energy technology perspectives program, and then highlighting special actions that need to be taken to meet objectives of that vision. And so it is with great pride and pleasure that we have our executive director here with us today, Mrs. Maria van der Hoven, who will highlight the importance of today's launch with respect to the overall IA strategic objectives. We will then follow with Mr. Alex Kerner, the Hydrogen Roadmap's main author, who will guide us through the roadmap findings, and then we will then be happy to open the floor to questions or requests for clarifications from the audience. You can do that by using the questions button that is on your screen, and then we will take those questions, read them aloud, and let the panelists answer those. And so without any further ado, it's my great honor to introduce the IA's Executive Director, Mrs. Maria van der Hoven. And so, Madam van der Hoven, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, François. So good evening, good morning, and good day, everybody, where you are in the world. And last week, I was in Rotterdam, and there was a meeting where there were many entrepreneurs that were working or involved in the Rotterdam Harbor. And one of the issues discussed was hydrogen. And somebody raised his hand and he said, well, quite close to my house, there is a hydrogen refueling station, but you know, it's seldom I see somebody there, or I don't know what kind of business case this is. And somebody else raised his hand and he said, well, you know, it's mine. And I know there are not many customers yet, but let's not misunderstand, let's not be mistaken, because hydrogen will be one of the fuels of the future. And we think he might be right. Maybe this is the next breakthrough when we are talking about low carbon technologies. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to climate, we generally agree on the end goal. And the end goal is limiting average global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And an evolution of the energy system is critical to ensuring that we arrive at that destination before we have collectively done irreversible damage to our climate. And yet, however much we agree on the destination, there are a countless number of roads we can travel to get there. Needless to say that our current road is unsustainable, economically, environmentally, and socially. And without decisive action, energy-related emissions of carbon dioxide will more than double by 2050. We must change our current path. However, this will take an energy revolution, and low-carbon energy technologies will have a crucial role to play. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, nuclear power, new transport technologies will all require widespread deployment if we are to achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Hydrogen, fuel cell technologies, once more developed, also have the potential to help achieve such reductions across several sectors of the energy systems, such as transport, industry, buildings, and the power sector. In fact, as is highlighted by the publication we are launching today, hydrogen and fuel cell technologies are one of only a small number of options that can link these different energy sources and end users together. And that said, although the greenhouse gas mitigation potential of hydrogen technology is promising, important obstacles for widespread deployment need to be overcome. And these barriers are mainly related to current costs of fuel cells and electrolyzers, the development of a hydrogen transmission, distribution and retail network, as well as the cost-efficient generation of hydrogen with a low carbon footprint. I know these are difficult, but not insurmountable challenges. Most hydrogen and fuel cell technologies are still in the early stages of commercialization and currently struggle to compete with alternative technologies, including other low carbon options, and that of course is due to high costs. Governments have a role to play. They can help accelerate the development and deployment of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies by ensuring continued research, development and demonstration funding for hydrogen generation and conversion technologies. We all know that the potential benefits are clear. Hydrogen is a flexible energy carrier that can be produced from any regionally prevalent primary energy source. And moreover, it can be effectively transformed into any form of energy for diverse end-use applications. And hydrogen is particularly well suited for use in fuel cells that efficiently use hydrogen to generate electricity and can meet the demanding needs of the transport sector. And critically, by enabling continued use of fossil fuel resources for end-use applications, hydrogen production in combination with CCS can provide energy security benefits and help maintain a diversified fuel mix. But you know, hydrogen is particularly useful as an energy carrier because it allows low-carbon energy to be stored. Small quantities of hydrogen can be stored under restricted space and weight requirements to enable long-distance, low-carbon driving using fuel cell electric vehicles, or FCEVs. Large quantities of hydrogen can be stored over long periods of time, facilitating the integration of high shares of reliable renewable energy into the energy system for power and heat. However, yes, we must acknowledge the challenges associated with the development of hydrogen generation and infrastructure. To take one example, the risks associated with market uptake of the FCEVs have been a significant barrier to infrastructure investment. Depending on the region, for each of the assumed 150 million FCEVs sold between now and 2050, somewhere in the region of $1,000 to $2,000 will need to be spent on hydrogen infrastructure development. So, if we are to make this technology viable, what needs to be done over the coming years? Well, first, continue to develop and deploy fuel efficiency and low greenhouse gas emission technologies across all energy sectors through market-driven, technology and fuel-neutral policies, and a stable policy and regulatory framework, including, for example, carbon pricing, feed-in tariffs, fuel economy standards, renewable fuel standards or zero-emission vehicle mandates, is important for raising market certainty for investors and entrepreneurs. And second, stimulate investment and early market deployment of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies and their infrastructure through effective policy support to bring down costs. And national and regional priorities should determine the value chains and the market barriers to be targeted. And third, other efforts would have to include the strengthening and harmonization of international codes and standards necessary for safe and reliable handling and metering of hydrogen in end-use applications. And fourth, more tangibly, proof on road practicality and economics across the supply chain of FCEVs by putting the first tens of thousands of vehicles on the road, along with hydrogen generation, transmission and distribution and refueling infrastructure. This is just a sample of what needs to be done. And I can tell you can read much more in the roadmap that we are launching today. Ladies and gentlemen, it took us 60 years from the first commercial production of oil before it captured 10% of the primary energy market, and then another 2 decades to reach 30%. And hindsight may have a habit of making past transitions appear neat and inevitable, but they were not. And the same applies to the innovations that made solar PV possible and increasingly cost competitive. The same will apply to the innovations ahead. And each innovation provides another possible road to our collective climate goals, and that can only be seen as a good thing. And now I will call upon Alex Kerner to take us through the roadmap in more detail. Alex is an energy analyst with the transport team of the IEA, and he is the principal author of the technology roadmap on hydrogen and fuel cells. And after his presentation, I'm sure Alex will be happy to take your questions. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this exhaustive and very interesting and complete introduction. I will take over now. I will start with a short introduction on hydrogen and hydrogen technologies and on our roadmap series in general. Then I will go in much more detail with hydrogen and fuel cells in transport, with hydrogen and fuel cells for reliable renewable power integration, with hydrogen in industry and buildings, And I will summarize with our key findings and the key actions for the next 10 years to take to make all this happen. This will be followed by a Q&A session. So hopefully you will all enjoy this presentation. Just some introductory remarks on the IEA Technology Roadmap series. The IEA Technology Roadmaps investigate in detail key technologies which are needed to reduce global CO2 emissions. They largely rely on the IEA ETP scenarios, which sketch a consistent storyline to transform the global energy system from a business-as-usual case, we call the 6-degree scenario, to a climate change mitigation pathway, which is our 2-degree scenario. What you actually see on this graph is the 6-degree emissions up to 2050, which are the upper border of this colored area graph, and the 2-degree emissions, which are the lower border of this colored area graph. And in between, all the technologies which need to contribute to come from a 6-degree to a 2-degree trajectory. The basic message is that all energy sectors and the large suite of technologies will need to contribute to reach the 2-degree target. And what we are actually doing with the technology roadmaps is to line out the detailed development paths of some of the key technologies. For this, we have a kind of standardized IEA roadmap process. We normally start with engaging stakeholders to get the expertise, which you might not have, which you might acquaint during the roadmap process. Then we are identifying a baseline. The question is, where is the technology today? What are today's costs? What are today's efficiencies of certain technologies? Then we establish a vision. What is the deployment path needed to achieve the 2050 goals, which are outlined in the ETP scenarios? And then we identify technical, regulatory, policy, financial, and also public acceptance barriers, which needs to be tackled. And finally, we provide some action items for stakeholders to overcome those barriers we were identifying. So now I'm actually starting with providing you much more insights from our analysis. First some remarks. So hydrogen fuel cells are a very broad topic. Yeah? So it covers energy supply and different energy demand sectors. It includes a lot of technologies and applications. And actually the benefits of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies can only be evaluated from an integrated point of view. I can already say with certitude that we won't have the time to cover all this in the webinar. So that's why I'll pick some of the most interesting applications which offer, or which we think offer, the greatest value proposition of hydrogen and fuel cell applications. And I'll use these examples to sketch the most important barriers, as well as the actions which can be taken to overcome these barriers. Yeah? So if you want to know that all, you need to read the hydrogen roadmap. That's the only thing I can say. Why hydrogen? As just lined out, hydrogen is an incredibly flexible energy carrier, which can be produced from a whole suite of primary energy sources. It can be effectively transformed into any form of energy for diverse end-use applications. And hydrogen with low carbon footprint has really the potential to facilitate significant reductions in energy-related CO2 emissions. In that respect, hydrogen is very much comparable with electricity. Yeah? So it is not an energy source, it is an energy carrier, and it is not per se low carbon. So its carbon footprint depends on the used primary energy source and the production pathway. But in addition, hydrogen can enable new linkages between energy supply and demand, and bridge renewable energies into demand sectors which are actually difficult to decarbonize, for example, the transport sector. So as I just said, hydrogen can facilitate the deployment of low carbon energy. Let's have a look at this busy schematic representation of today's and future low carbon energy system to actually better understand how this is possible. Let's just focus on the left side, which is showing a representation of today's energy system. Today's energy system is dominated by fossil fuels, which include oil, natural gas, coal, but also nuclear. And energy supply to the demand sectors using different transmission and distribution networks for power, heat, liquid, and gaseous fuels. The transmission and distribution networks are those circles in this graph. Huh? There are almost no interconnections between the different transmission and distribution grids. And today, energy supply follows demand. And this is really crucial, and it's only feasible because we have all these fantastic fossil fuels which can easily be stored and transported and used when and where needed, but unfortunately they emit large amounts of CO2, so we need to do something. On the right side, you see a representation of a future energy system. In such a 2-degree scenario, in such a 2-degree world, energy supply needs to rely on variable renewables to a large extent. And this also means that supply cannot be modulated that easily to follow energy demand, because wind and sun cannot be controlled. But this also means that in turn, such a low carbon energy system is much less flexible. And here's actually the point where hydrogen could play a role. Hydrogen has the ability to reintroduce part of this lost flexibility to the energy system. This is partly due to the fact that it can be produced from so many different energy carriers, but it is also due to the fact that hydrogen can actually link different energy transmission and distribution networks. For example, it could link the power grid with the distribution network for liquid and gaseous fuels. It can be used as a fuel in transport, but it can be produced from electricity. Yeah? Same is true. It could bridge renewable electricity into the natural gas grid. So actually hydrogen can play some kind of role to get back flexibility which is lost in a less flexible low carbon energy system. One of the key aspects is that hydrogen is an energy carrier which can store low carbon footprint energy. Really this characteristic of being able of storing low carbon energy at a sufficient energy density, for example, to make it possible to have a 500 or 600 kilometer range with a fuel cell electric vehicle, is something very special, and this makes it pretty unique compared to electricity, for example. Yeah? So small quantities of hydrogen can be stored under weight and space requirement, and large quantities of hydrogen can be stored over long periods of time. And this actually could facilitate the integration of very large shares of renewable, variable renewable energies into the energy system. In addition to this, hydrogen could also be used as a feedstock. This is how hydrogen is used mainly today. Today it is not used as an energy carrier, it is used as a feedstock. And hydrogen will also be demanded in the future as a feedstock, for example, in the refining industry, especially against the background of diminishing oil quality. Much more hydrogen will be needed to actually produce the high quality fuels which we demand. If the carbon footprint out of this kind of hydrogen could be lowered, then this would actually also have an impact on the carbon footprint of the fuel. Fuel cells and electrolyzers play a key role. Electrolyzers are needed to produce hydrogen from water and to convert electricity into chemically bound energy. Fuel cells, in turn, are needed to transform hydrogen back into electricity at the highest efficiency. I mean, it is really important to note that hydrogen will always be a very high value energy carrier, so you should only use it in high efficiency conversion processes. Now we'll have a look at some more concrete applications. For this we will start with hydrogen and fuel cell technologies in transport. In the transport sector, individual motorized transport with passenger cars is actually pretty difficult to decarbonize, and again energy storage is key. The higher demand for autonomy is, the more difficult is it to store the energy which is needed on board the vehicle. And this is a little bit what this kind of graph wants to say. Yeah? So on the x-axis, you see range of cars in kilometers, starting from whatever 0 to some 1,400 kilometers. On the y-axis, you see the well-to-wheel emissions of these different vehicle types in grams of CO2 per kilometer. So basically, in the transport sector, there are 3 technological options to decarbonize individual motorized transport from a technology perspective. You can have battery electric vehicles and the direct use of low carbon electricity. You can have hybrid vehicles and plug-in hybrids in combination with the use of liquid fuels which have a high blend share of sustainable biofuels. Or, and finally, you could use fuel cell electric vehicles and hydrogen. Each of these technology options have their specific advantages and disadvantages. For example, if you think about battery electric vehicles, they are much likely to be always restricted in terms of range. And even if the range could be enhanced substantially, then there's still the barrier of how to get the electricity in the battery and what time this would need. So recharging time is actually a serious issue. If you think about biofuels, then there's much uncertainty about the sustainable supply of those biofuels. And actually, there is quite some competition around the biofuels. If you look in the transport sector, there are modes like aviation and shipping. So these long-distance transport modes, which will always rely on or most likely rely on very energy-dense fuels. And here, biofuels might play a more important role. And actually, biofuels are also demanded by the power sector. So there's a lot of competition around biofuels. And in this respect, hydrogen really could offer a pathway to a more sustainable future, and even beyond 2050, if you think even longer term. Because FCVs, fuel cell electric vehicles, could actually achieve a mobility service which is comparable to today's conventional cars, but which could serve at potentially very low well-to-wheel carbon emissions. But also in case of fuel cell electric vehicles, there's a big disadvantage, and this is namely lies in the absence of hydrogen generation, transmission, distribution, and retail infrastructure. This is actually a barrier which needs to be overcome. Which is why we were looking into some more detail in the transport sector. We were investigating the effect of a much more intensified use of fuel cell electric vehicles on energy use, emissions, and costs. So therefore, we developed a variant of our normal 2-degree scenario, which is the 2-degree high hydrogen scenario. And this scenario asks the question: what if by 2050, what if by 2050, 25% of all passenger cars were FCEVs? What would that have as an effect on energy use, emissions, and costs? What these 3 graphs are showing is basically the passenger light-duty vehicle stock by technology for this IEA ETP 2DS high hydrogen scenario. And basically, we were selecting 3 regions: the US, EU4, and Japan. EU4 is a little bit an artifact, and this is due to our, let's say, aggregation of regions which are already in the model. So EU4 comprises France, Germany, Italy, and the UK. So why are we looking at these 3 regions only? Because if you want to seriously investigate hydrogen in transport, you need to introduce somehow a little bit of spatial resolution in models, and this is always very complicated. And therefore, we decided to focus on the key regions where we already see today a lot of hydrogen development, which will not mean that there are not other regions which develop also a lot of fuel cell and hydrogen technologies, namely Korea, namely other countries in Europe which are not comprised in this EU4 region. In any case, in a 2-degree scenario, the share of conventional vehicles needs to drop below 30%. Otherwise, 2 degrees will not be achieved in transport. In this scenario, we were looking on the intensified effect of using more fuel cell electric vehicles. Why using more fuel cell electric vehicles? Because actually the setup of a entirely new hydrogen infrastructure and retail hydrogen transmission, distribution, and retail infrastructure can get less costly if ramp-up of fuel cell electric vehicles is quick, and if finally a pretty large share of fuel cell electric vehicles penetrate into this stock. So this is kind of a very optimistic scenario, if you want to. Now let's have a look on the CO2 mitigation potential of fuel cell electric vehicles in our scenario. These plots again show the CO2 emissions of the 6-degree scenario, which is the upper border, and the 2-degree scenario, which is the lower border, for the named 3 regions. The colored areas specify the contribution of different mitigation measures. We in ETP, we use the avoid, shift, improve concept to build our 2-degree scenario for transport. Avoiding transport means that the transport activity is reduced. This can be achieved, for example, by better urban planning. Shifting transport means that transport demand is shifted to more efficient modes. For example, individual motorized transport is shifted to rail or bus. And finally, improving transport technologies includes the deployment of high-efficient conventional vehicles, the uptake of alternative powertrains, for example, fuel cell electric vehicles, and also switching to alternative fuels like biofuels. These 3 plots, they show the contributions of fuel cell electric vehicles to the CO2 mitigation for the 3 regions, which is the light green area on the top of the graphs. So according to our scenario, the contribution of fuel cell electric vehicles to cumulative total transport CO2 emission reductions between now and 2050 could account for between 7% and 10%. This actually sounds not that much, but you need to take into account that we are talking about the whole transport sector. We are talking about shipping, aviation, rail, and road. So basically, against this background, achieving a 10% contribution to the total emission reduction is actually quite a large share. In total, this translates to almost 3 gigatons of CO2, which could be saved by fuel cell electric vehicles between now and 2050. This sounds all wonderful, but why don't we have fuel cell electric vehicles then? On the one side, fuel cell electric vehicles are still pretty expensive, and so far only very few models are available on the market. Yeah? On the other side, the absence of the hydrogen generation, transmission, distribution, and retail network is an important barrier. To really make fuel cell electric vehicles an option, large amounts of infrastructure need to be built from scratch. And here we are talking about thousands of stations, yeah? And we're also talking about thousands of kilometers of pipelines, and we are talking about a lot of trucks to distribute the hydrogen from the production site to the demand side. And in addition to this, there's also some uncertainty. Will fuel cell electric vehicles be accepted by the market, and how fast can the market actually ramp up? And especially in this nexus between building up the infrastructure and rolling out the vehicles, this uncertainty plays quite a crucial role. Let's just look at the example of such a hydrogen refueling station. What this graph is showing, or what this stylized graph is showing, is the cumulative cash flow curve of a hydrogen station over time. And what you see, that over a pretty long time, there might be negative cash flow. This negative cash flow is caused by actually pretty expensive equipment and low utilization in the very beginning. These are actually the 2 main barriers. Yeah? So, but there are also means to reduce this valley of death. What is basically needed is the introduction of very small hydrogen stations at the beginning to reduce investment costs and also to minimize the underutilization. Plus, hydrogen station needs to be clustered around early demand centers. Yeah? In this, doing it that way, even in a very early phase, acceptable hydrogen demand at the hydrogen station could be achieved. And of course, public support can help to create a business case. Which is the theme of our next slide. So smart planning is not sufficient to make fuel cell electric vehicles an attractive option to the consumer. Yeah? The rollout of this new technology would need proactive intervention. So what we are actually doing, we were trying to estimate the amount of, let's call it subsidies, which would be necessary to make fuel cell electric vehicles cost competitive with efficient gasoline cars. And this is also very important to note. It needs to be compared to efficient gasoline cars. We need to stay in one and the same scenario. The efficient gasoline cars in 2050 will not be the gasoline car of today. So therefore, we were basically calculating total costs of driving. The total cost of driving comprise the investment cost of the vehicle plus the lifetime fuel cost of the vehicle, and this is all normalized to the lifetime mileage of the vehicle. So basically, we get a US dollar cent value per kilometer. Yeah? And we were comparing these total costs of driving with conventional but efficient gasoline vehicles. Yeah? And then we were calculating the amount of money which would be needed to make fuel cell electric vehicles cost competitive with efficient gasoline vehicles. Yeah? So basically, on this economic metric, you can compare the economic feasibility or the economic performance of different technology options. What this graph is showing is the result for our EU4 region. Yeah? Here, the blue line denotes the fuel cell electric vehicle stock. In this case, in the 4 EU countries, in our scenario, we have a little below 40 million fuel cell electric vehicles by 2050. The orange line represents the absolute amount of subsidy per vehicle necessary to close the economic gap compared to an efficient gasoline internal combustion engine car. Basically, in the beginning, this would be very much. This can be in the. This could be in the amount of 50 to 70,000 US dollars per vehicle, but this actually this very high subsidy drops very quickly to below 5,000 US dollars per car, and this is actually due to the assumed high learning potential of fuel cell systems in fuel cell electric vehicles. And then finally, we introduced a measure to compare the absolute amount of money which would be needed to some more accessible values, which is why we compared, or we expressed the absolute subsidy necessary to make fuel cell electric vehicles cost competitive. We expressed them as a share of the petroleum fuel tax revenue, which in this EU4 region would flow into the government pocket to from petroleum fuel taxation. And the interesting result is that actually even at the peak of subsidy, this share would not pass 5%. Yeah? Which actually means, although we are talking about an expensive technology and a lot of infrastructure needs to be built, it is still somehow reasonable if you compare it to petroleum fuel tax income. One important thing to make, which is necessary to make fuel cell electric vehicles cost competitive, hydrogen would need to be exempted from fuel taxation, unless cars get cost competitive, and then hydrogen can be taxed. According to our calculations, for Europe, you would need subsidies in the range of some 20 billion US dollars to make fuel cell electric vehicles competitive. If you look at the 3 regions together, US, EU4, and Japan, probably 90 billion US dollar would be needed to bring on the road around 30 million fuel cell electric vehicles. That's it so far to our transport results, and now I'm talking a little more about hydrogen and fuel cells for variable renewable energy integration. In our 2-degree scenario, the decarbonization of the power sector is one of the main pillars to actually achieve the 2-degree. So until 2050, global average carbon intensity of power needs to drop to around 40 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour from actually 530 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour today. So we really need to have a massive decarbonization of the power sector. But this also means that the share of reliable renewable power in the electricity mix needs to reach up to almost 45% in some of the regions, for example, in the EU. As power supply and demand needs to be balanced instantaneously and everywhere in the power grid, this high share of reliable renewable penetration might really result in significant temporal and geographical imbalances between power supply and demand. And this actually might result in significant amounts of renewable power which might be curtailed. Because if renewable power cannot be sucked up by the power grid, then normally the wind farm will just be switched off. So actually, this high penetration of variable renewable power in the electricity mix could also be a source of some significant amount of electricity which could come at low price. But here it's really important to note that we are talking about the price. The surplus renewable electricity has a very low market value, but it is produced at the same costs. So this is not free electricity, it is just low value electricity. Now, hydrogen-based systems could actually establish new energy vectors to integrate surplus variable renewable power into the energy system, or to reintroduce better. Maybe that's the better term. We can call them power-to-X trajectories. These trajectories comprise power to power. In that case, renewable electricity is transformed into hydrogen via electrolysis. It is stored or can be stored and then retransformed to electricity via fuel cells. This way, large amounts of renewable power could be stored. We have the power to gas trajectory. So renewable power is transformed into hydrogen, which is then mixed with natural gas. This is what we call blending, or transformed into synthetic methane, which is with the help of a methanization process. This way, renewable hydrogen could be integrated into already existing transmission and distribution infrastructure, which is the existing natural gas grid, which is already existing in a lot of countries, and it can also be used with existing end-use conversion technologies such as gas turbines, for example, for power generation. And then, as a third trajectory, we here look into the power-to-fuel trajectory. Renewable electricity is transformed into hydrogen and then sold as a transport fuel to be used in fuel cell electric vehicles. What is important to note is, and this is the actual, let's say, main number content of this slide. All these transformation chains are long, with a lot of conversion steps, and this ends up in pretty low overall efficiencies. I mean, we are talking about, so it is very important to always compare energy of the same quality. Even if we are talking about power to gas, we want to have electricity at the end and not natural gas. So basically, we need to compare conversion efficiencies back to electricity again. And really here we see that the electricity which we get out of such a power-to-X trajectory might only be as little as 20% of the electricity which we put into this trajectory. So basically, it is important that we understand that this only works with low-value surplus renewable electricity. If electricity is generated on purpose to be used to be transformed into hydrogen, then economics and everything looks not that good, and I think it would basically not make too much sense from an energy system perspective. But against this background, it is also very important to know that quantifying the amount of surplus electricity or of low-value renewable electricity which might occur in an energy system with very high shares of variable renewables is really a key task to estimate the potential for renewable hydrogen. And quantifying this amount of electricity is very complicated because you need to take into account everything at once. You need to have an integrated model because you need to look into all end-use sectors. you need to have a long-term optimization tool, because you need to know what will be the fleet of your power sector by 2050. But you also need to know, have a very high time-wise resolution, because you need to capture the operational characteristics of a power sector. Yeah? So that's really getting into very complicated models. And to make it even more complicated, you actually need to have some kind of spatial resolution to actually really account for, let's say, transmission grid bottlenecks and stuff like this. So this is actually a very difficult task, and I try to formulate this a little bit in this roadmap, that without a robust quantification of this potential of surplus electricity, it is very hard to discuss hydrogen technologies. We were looking a little bit in the electricity storage potential in the 2-degree scenario. Why are we doing this? Because actually power to power storage systems would be an electricity storage, a mean to store electricity, and electricity storage is already used today. Yeah? So what you actually see in this graph is the installed capacity for electricity storage in 2011 and in 2050 in our 2DS and in our 2DS storage breakthrough scenario. So already today, 85 gigawatt of electricity storage capacity, which is mainly pumped hydro, is installed in the shown regions. And these 4 regions, I think they account for roughly 60% of the produced or of the generated electricity globally. Yeah? So 85 gigawatts of electricity storage capacity already exists today. Our estimates with our modeling tools come to the result that by 2050, in a 2-degree scenario, this electricity storage capacity might be quadrupled. And it's important to note here that this might be a conservative estimate, because our modeling approach only captures time-wise mismatch and no geographical mismatch. But actually these, let's say, geographical bottlenecks, the transmission line bottlenecks, they might be very important when evaluating the need for electricity storage. But it is also important to keep in mind that electricity storage is only one thing which can bring back flexibility into the power sector. Yeah? There are other measures like demand-side management, grid extension, the optimal use of the existing fleet, smart grids, and so on and so on. And all these measures need to be used in order of their economic performance. This plot actually shows where hydrogen-based electricity storage could add the highest value. Yeah? So electricity storage can play along a large bandwidth of discharge duration, and also along a large bandwidth of power requirement. Power requirement and discharge duration together actually determine the energy capacity of your electricity storage. Yeah? And discharge duration can be in the region of seconds and minutes if you're talking about voltage regulation, but it can also comprise storage for weeks or even seasons. And here we are talking about large-scale, long-term energy storage. Yeah? And actually hydrogen has its, or could possibly find its place within this large-scale, long-term energy storage applications. Yeah? And actually, in fact, they might be the only storage option which could provide acceptable levelized costs of electricity if we look at the large-scale and long-term energy storages. Yeah? All these large-scale, long-term energy storage systems suffer from very low annual utilization rates. And in this case, pumped hydro, but also compressed air storage, they are looking not so promising. Yeah? Because hydrogen is much more energy dense than these two competitors, hydrogen might really be the option to cover this segment. Now, finally, we wanted to know a little bit what hydrogen-based renewable power integration pathway could offer the highest value proposition. Is it power to power? Would it be power to gas or power to fuel? What we were doing here, we were just looking into, or we were calculating the marginal abatement costs of these three options. It looks like that in the more distant future, the power to fuel pathway achieves the lowest marginal abatement costs, and they can get as low to, let's say, something like $20 per ton of CO2 to $150 per ton of CO2. This is actually mainly due to the fact that the transport sector is difficult to decarbonize, and all the other decarbonization options are expensive as well. Yeah? Plus, if fuel cell electric vehicles are produced at large scale, it seems to be that there is a huge potential for cost reductions for fuel cells. So this is why, in this comparison, the power to fuel option seems to be the most promising one. If we look at power to power, it seems like this technology could also become an attractive decarbonization option. Our calculated marginal abatement costs, they are in the range of $100 to $200 per ton of CO2. Given that we have around $150 per ton of CO2 in our ETP model in the 2-degree scenario by 2050, the power-to-power storage option could actually also be interesting. Yeah? If we are looking at power to gas, then the comparison of marginal abatement costs is not that overwhelming. Yeah? And this is basically mainly due to the fact that even if you have very low-cost electricity, hydrogen or even synthetic methane is still more expensive than natural gas. And as it just replaces natural gas in its end-use application, and the marginal abatement costs of power-to-gas applications seem to be a bit higher. So this is really, so we think power-to-gas might be a good option as a transition technology, but it seems not to be the preferred option, or it seems not to be a development target per se for energy systems. I'll say some very few words about hydrogen and fuel cell technology in industry and buildings. Basically, low carbon hydrogen can be a mean to reduce upstream emissions in liquid fuel production processes. This is what I already said at the beginning. In the steel industry, the more efficient use of hydrogen has the potential to contribute to significant CO2 emission reductions. It actually can also play an enabling role for the application of CCS technologies. The use of renewable hydrogen in industry, of course, hinges upon its economic competitiveness, and in particular when compared to hydrogen from natural gas, steam methane reformation with carbon capture and storage. In the building sector, natural gas-fueled fuel cell micro-CHP systems could help increasing the efficiency of buildings, but they also struggle with costs. So there are opportunities in industry and buildings, but we, at least in our scenarios, do not expect them to be the main driver for hydrogen and fuel cell development. So what are our key findings? The use of hydrogen in transport can enable long-distance and low-carbon driving. Hydrogen-based systems such as power-to-fuel, power-to-gas, or power-to-power can be employed. To make use of variable renewable energy integration, and can be used to reintegrate otherwise curtailed renewable energies. And hydrogen production in combination with CCS can enable the continued use of fossil resources for end-use applications under a 2-degree scenario. So really, hydrogen can play a pivotal role based on its flexibility with regard to generation and conservation. And the use of hydrogen is most valuable if it's based on hydrogen's ability to store low-carbon energy. If these two things come together, we think that hydrogen could help reduce carbon emissions in energy sectors which are difficult to decarbonize. We have some transport-specific results. As said, a 25% share of fuel cell electric vehicles by 2050 could reduce total cumulative, could contribute 10% to all total cumulative transport-related carbon emission reductions to achieve 2DS scenario. Assuming a fast ramp-up of fuel cell electric vehicles, a self-sustaining market could be achieved 15 to 20 years after the introduction of the first 10,000 fuel cell electric vehicles. And as already lined out, the development of the hydrogen infrastructure is costly. Yeah? So we're talking about something in between $900 and $1,900 per vehicle for each of the 150 million vehicles sold between now and then in our 2-degree scenario. So what are the concrete steps for the next 10 years? So if hydrogen technologies are to play a significant role, we need a strong will to tackle climate change. Huh? I mean, hydrogen technologies seem to make most sense against climate, against the application of climate mitigation policies. Hydrogen and fuel cell technologies will benefit from technology-neutral and climate-focused policies such as carbon pricing, such as stringent and long-term fuel economy standards, or such as zero-emission vehicle mandates. But still, there are cost barriers, and these cost barriers, especially in the early phase, need to be overcome by specific policies which stimulate investment and early market development, deployment of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies, as well as the needed infrastructure. And this, for example, is just lined out in our transport results, could, for example, comprise something like the exemption of hydrogen from fuel taxation, or even direct subsidies to a certain technology, in this case, fuel cell electric vehicles. Of course, the continued development of codes and standards plays a vital role. Of course, sustained public transport, but also the unlocking, sustained public support, but also the unlocking of private funds for further RD&D is a key element of such a policy portfolio. And finally, a generally deeper understanding of the dynamics within the energy system is key to evaluate the potential of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies. So we need to improve our tools to better understand where the role of hydrogen could actually be. We also have some concrete key actions for the next 10 years. If fuel cell electric vehicles are to play a major role in the future, we think it would be necessary to put the first 10,000 of fuel cell electric vehicles on the road, alongside with hydrogen generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure, including at least 500 to 1,000 stations. It is also important to engage all international stakeholders from relevant industry, as well as the regional, national, and local authorities in developing developing risk mitigation strategies for infrastructure rollout. This is really something very important. Yeah? Those stakeholders, they need to work towards a common goal. Otherwise, I think it will be very difficult for hydrogen technologies to really achieve significant shares. And of course, with respect to reliable renewable integration, and also with respect to power to gas, regulatory frameworks are important. These frameworks must be set up in a way that barriers for grid access are removed for storage technologies. For example, it could be exempt from grid transmission fees, but also there need to be some upper limits or some common understanding on how to blend hydrogen into natural gas and still ensure a continuous quality of natural gas. And last but not least, increasing the data on resource availability to produce actually renewable hydrogen is a key element. And this is what I just mentioned before. We need to have better tools to quantify the possible surplus electricity or possibly curtailed electricity in energy systems with very high renewable share. I think that's it so far. Thank you very much. Here you find the internet address where you could actually access all of our technology roadmaps. And I think now we are open to take some questions for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. I think if I want to sum up all we've just said in a nutshell, I think what you've demonstrated quite drastically is that hydrogen has a huge potential to help us meet many of our energy policy challenges of the future, but getting from where we are today to where we would need to be is both going to be a formidable challenge, but also has a lot of uncertainty and risk associated with it. I think this kind of reflects also many of the questions that we've received from our audience. One that I would like to start is, because you were looking at the generation aspect and so forth, we had many questions regarding how detailed, how much varied solutions you've been looking at. And so we have one question that asks whether we've looked at fuel cells that run on fossil fuels, such as natural gas, as a bridge technology. For example, solid oxide fuel cells have been proposed and tested for this purpose, some of which generate hydrogen as an exhaust. So what has been the analysis done on those technologies, fuel cell technologies that can take fossil fuels and go directly to the step of electricity generation or hydrogen and electricity production?
In our analysis, in our modeling, in our model setup, we did not take into account fuel cells which are operating on natural gas to produce electricity. But nonetheless, we acknowledge that this technology might play a vital role in getting down costs of the fuel cell technology, because it can actually use fuels which are already distributed with existing transmission and distribution grids. So why did we not go into more detail in with respect to natural gas fueled fuel cells for electricity generation? I think, as I lined out during the presentation, is that we think that let's say, the highest value proposed by hydrogen technologies lies when, or can be achieved when, the characteristic of hydrogen to store low carbon energy can be used or is used. Yeah? If there is grid access, for example, to natural gas, there are other major technologies which can transform natural gas into, for example, electricity at quite comparable or even higher efficiencies. I mean, solid oxide fuel cells, they have very high efficiencies, but they are also pretty expensive at the moment. A combined cycle natural gas power plant can achieve efficiencies of 60% as well, but it's a major and well-developed technologies. So here there might be a advantage of fuel cells to be a bit more scalable than other technologies, but we did not take into account this stationary application of using fuel cells with the help with natural gas to produce electricity.
So a related question was, as you say, there are stepwise approaches to ramp up technologies. If we were able to create a significant demand for low carbon hydrogen today, could it be met more cost effectively then by coupling fossil fuels with CCS?
I mean, that's a super difficult question, if you want. So, yeah? It is about centralizing and decentralizing an energy system. This is one, let's say, one dimension to answer this question. So if we are talking about centralized hydrogen production, for example, with natural gas and CCS, then we see pretty significant benefits of economies of scale. So this cannot be really transferred into a decentralized approach, because then you have actually pretty small units standing around. Still, we think, I mean, if you have centralized hydrogen production, then you need to transport the hydrogen to your demand center, yeah? And the transportation and the transmission of hydrogen is expensive. If you would produce your hydrogen on site, for example, using electrolyzers, then you would actually get rid of this transportation lag. But still, if you use electrolyzers on site, you need to cope with the normal electricity price, and the normal electricity price is somewhere around 9 or 11 cents per kilowatt hour in the US, maybe up to 20 cents in Europe. Huh? So basically, if you would use this kind of electricity with electrolyzers which are on site, then your hydrogen, which is produced by these kind of electrolyzers, would be much more expensive than centralized production and transport. This is why we actually emphasize the role of surplus renewable electricity, because I think this is really the option to bring renewable hydrogen in the game, and this is where we say that this integrated view on the whole energy sector is necessary to actually get an idea of how much of this kind of electricity would be available. I mean, it's very hard to answer this question. So because it's really such a broad field.
And when you're talking about centralized versus decentralized, one of the issues you mentioned is the transmission of the hydrogen. The question that we've got is, can the gas grid be converted to transport hydrogen? Can the existing gas grid be used to help use the benefits of centralized hydrogen production and distribute it in a more cost-effective way?
So far as I understood the literature I read and the people I spoke with, there might be a certain potential to convert a natural gas grid into a hydrogen grid. Although hydrogen has the, let's say, the potential to embrittle steel, but this is really a function of the transportation pressure of the hydrogen. And at lower pressures, apparently, this is not such a big problem with the current pipelines, with the current steel pipelines which are used. But then, if you look at armatures and if you're looking at metering systems, there might be other elements in such a natural gas transmission system which cap the amount of hydrogen which could be transported. I think this is really dependent on a base-to-base, case-to-case, on a case-to-case decision.
And you were talking about, again, the centralized decentralized aspect, and the need for being able to produce hydrogen locally, but you've also demonstrated that electrolysis is very low efficiency. In terms of these clean hydrogen production sites, have you also looked at thermochemical production for hydrogen?
First of all, I think electrolysis is not really low efficiency. Yeah? So today we are seeing efficiencies in the range of 70% for a proton exchange membrane electrolysis, and there's some margin to increase this. We, in our scenario, in our analysis, we didn't look at the chemothermal splitting of matter. I mean, you need very high temperatures for this, and so far, what I know is that you can, for example, or you would need to, you would need a little nuclear reactor to actually produce the high temperature heat, and we didn't combine nuclear technology and hydrogen technology in this case.
Now, in terms of that, demand side of things, one of the questions here comes and asks, have you considered power to liquid synthetic fuels as one of the other options? So we talked about power to gas, power to electricity. How about power to synthetic fuels?
We didn't consider this in detail in our modeling. Nonetheless, we are aware that there's a whole range of synthetic liquid fuels which can be produced using hydrogen, for example, DME and methanol and whatnot. So there's really a huge bandwidth of different conversion pathways. With the technology roadmap on hydrogen and fuel cells, we actually focused a little more on the demand side technologies, and we were including the supply side of hydrogen to the level necessary to say something more or less intelligent about our whole life cycle, greenhouse gases, and on cost, and so on and so on. But we did not include all of these very numerous hydrogen-based conversion pathways to produce other synthetic liquid fuels.
So in terms of these other demand centers, have you also considered microfuel cells for potable power as one of the potential technologies linked to this roadmap?
We talk about portable power in the technology status today section, but we were not including this in our scenarios. I think the reason for this is that, I mean, we are really looking at, let's say, kind of potentially game-changing technologies which have the potential to really have significant impact on overall CO2 emissions. So portable power is certainly a very interesting field, but in general, we don't really look at this kind of technology in publications like ETP or within the technology roadmaps, because it's just a little bit too small scale for our modeling purposes.
And how about fuel cell in transportation, but for heavy goods vehicle? Has that been also considered?
So actually, we consider this. Actually, we have fuel cell electric vehicles in road freight transport in our modeling approach. Actually, these vehicles, they could play a pretty important role, because they actually so in our scenario, we have about 10% of the commercial vehicles being fuel cell electric vehicles by 2050, even 10% of the heavy duty trucks. We know that there seems to be some more uncertainty around the success or the possible success of fuel cells in the road freight sector. For example, because you need to store a lot of hydrogen, and even if you compress hydrogen to 700 bar, if you liquefy it, the volume which is required by the hydrogen storage might be a problem for long-haul transport. Yeah? But still, we have these trucks in our scenario, and we actually see that they play a pretty interesting role, because they have a lot of hydrogen demand. They actually bump up the utilization rate of the whole infrastructure. So the, let's say, concerted introduction of fuel cell vehicles in the road freight and in the passenger sector might have some synergies with respect to the utilization of the hydrogen transmission, distribution, and retail infrastructure.
Great. Now, we also have a few questions in terms of the overall benefits that you mentioned about the calculations of abatement costs that were presented. Do those assume the free renewable electricity and a coal plant as a reference emission value? How do you basically assess those abatement costs in terms of the energy mix?
For calculating the abatement costs, we did not use free electricity, because we think that's pretty unlikely, that or zero cost electricity, because we think that's pretty unlikely to happen. We used electricity which costs between 2 and 3 US cents per kilowatt hour, depending on the region, and we assume that these electricity would be available at different amounts. So basically, I mean, there's one very interesting study from NREL, their electricity futures study, and they actually managed to quantify the amount of curtailed electricity as a function of variable renewable energy penetration in the power sector. Yeah? And one result of this study is that at very high shares of variable renewable power in the range of, let's say, or at very high shares of renewable power only. Renewable power includes hydro and all those renewables which are not variable. Yeah? So in the NREL study, there are some numbers saying at 80% or 90% of renewable power, you might see curtailment in the range of 7% of the total power production. Yeah? And this even taking into account, as I understood it, even taking into account storage technology and also having some kind of geographical resolution in the model. So we were using these kind of assumptions to estimate a little bit the, or we were using these kind of results to estimate a little bit the potentially available amount of low-cost electricity. Yeah? And for the marginal abatement costs, we used this kind of electricity, and we calculated abatement costs for the different power to X trajectories. Yeah? So the base conditions, they were all the same for power to fuel, power to gas, and power to power technologies. Yeah.
Now, another point that you mentioned was that one of the potential route to produce the hydrogen was to use fossil fuel reforming with CCS. One of the questions that we were asked by our audience is, what's the efficiency actually of converting carbon dioxide to use that fossil fuel as a feedstock?
So what we see is, or what I learned from the literature is that actually, because the exhaust of a steam methane reformer is pretty high CO2 concentrated, it looks like the efficiency penalty of coupling CCS with steam methane reformation is pretty moderate. Yeah? I think the more important problem is to actually find the storage, the carbon storage sites, and to transport the carbon dioxide to the storage site and to compress it and to monitor it and so on and so on. I think the efficiency penalty for the steam methane reformer is pretty moderate. I don't have the number out of my head. I would need to look into the publication, which is again another reason to download the publication and look for the number. So I can only highly encourage this.
Great, thanks. Well, I think then we will use this advertisement as a closing remark for our webinar. I want to thank all of our audience for participating in such large numbers and providing us some very interesting questions that allowed us to go deeper into the analysis. Thank Alex for the great analysis, the great presentation, and give special thanks to our Executive Director for supporting this work, which we see has a great potential to help us meet energy policy objectives of the future, but still has a long way to go to be able to materialize itself. So with that, I again want to thank everyone for their participation, encourage all to download the publication, read through it, and if you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to address it to us at the IA. We'll be very happy to act upon those when we get those requests. Thank you very much, and have a good day or a good night wherever you may be. Thank you.
Thank you.